It was 2 in the morning. Nora was asleep in his bed, fever finally broken. Caleb sat in the armchair beside her, arms on his knees, hands clasped together, watching the rise and fall of her shoulder like it was the only thing keeping him in the room. Every time she shifted, his chest tightened. Every time she made a small sound in her sleep, he held his breath. She had only come up because her heater died. A practical solution, a neighbor doing what neighbors do. But if she woke and found him watching like this, everything would change. And still, he did not close his eyes. 6 weeks earlier, the building held 2 strangers who had not yet made a single mistake. The first time Caleb saw her, she was coming up the stairs from the basement while he was coming down from the second floor. They both stopped. She had a camera bag on one shoulder and a coffee in her other hand, and she was looking at something on her phone. And then she looked up and found him there, and the phone went still. Brown eyes. A small, careful pause, the kind that means someone is deciding something quickly. He nodded. She nodded back. They passed each other on the landing without a word. He kept walking. But at the bottom of the stairs, he was aware precisely of the sound of her footsteps continuing down to the basement level. And he stood there for a second with no good reason, before going back up to the second floor and picking up his chisel. He had known someone was in the basement unit. He had not known she looked like that. He had heard her laugh once, through the ceiling, talking on the phone. The sound had surprised him enough to make him set the chisel down. Low and genuine, nothing held back in it. He had thought about that laugh for most of that afternoon without meaning to, and then he had put it away. The way you put away things that are not yours. That was all. That was the whole of it. Those first 2 weeks of November. The second time was a few days later. He came down to check the mailboxes, and she was already there, flipping through envelopes with the distracted efficiency of someone who does not expect good news by post. She heard him on the stairs and looked up. The careful pause again, shorter this time. "You're the one doing the restoration," she said. Not unfriendly, just precise. "Upper floors and the facade," he said. "Not the basement." She nodded, as if confirming something she had already figured out. "I keep hearing the tools in the mornings." "I start early. I can keep it later if it bothers you." She shook her head. "I'm usually out before you start." She turned back to her mail. Then, without looking up, "I'm Nora." "Caleb," he said. She gave a brief nod, tucked the envelopes under her arm, and went back downstairs. He stood at the mailboxes for a moment after she left. He had not planned to stay there. He took his mail and went back up, and on the second floor landing, he stopped and realized he was trying to remember the exact way she had said her own name. Like it was simply information. Like she was handing him something and expected nothing back. He went back to work. He thought about it anyway. The third time was not something either of them planned. He was working on the second floor, a Tuesday afternoon, when he heard her voice in the corridor below. Controlled, but with an edge she was working hard to keep out of it. He set down what he was doing and came down. She was standing outside the utility room, a towel around her forearm, water spreading dark across the hallway floor from the gap beneath the door. She had her phone to her ear, leaving a message with someone who was not picking up. She saw him and lowered the phone. "The shut-off valve," he said. "I know where it is. I can't get the handle to turn." A beat. "You fixed Mrs. Hartwell's radiator last week. I thought you might." So she had noticed. He said nothing about that. He moved past her, got the valve closed in under a minute, and came back out to find her wringing the towel in her hands. "Thank you," she said, even and prompt, like something being paid back so the account stayed clean. He looked at her. She looked at him then, brown eyes sharp and tired, and for a second he forgot the wet floor spreading behind her. "Caleb," he said. She almost smiled, just almost. "I know," she said. "We've met." She picked up her camera bag from against the wall and went back downstairs. He stood in the wet corridor for a moment. Then he went back up. He worked until the light was gone. He was not thinking about her name, or the way she said "I know," or the fact that she had been watching him closely enough to notice the radiator. He was not thinking about any of that. He was mostly not thinking about it. The next morning, there was a paper bag outside his door, 2 pastries from the bakery on Reed, and a coffee, still warm. No note. He sat at the work table and ate both slowly and drank the coffee and looked at the November light flat and cold on the rooftops, and felt, without examining it, that something had shifted very slightly on its axis. The next morning, she refused to overthink it. She knocked on his door at 9. She told herself it was a practical invitation. She was already wrong about that. When he opened it, she was standing in the corridor with a second coffee in her hand and a direct expression that made it clear she had already decided this was not a big thing and was proceeding accordingly. "I'm going to walk Hendricks Road today if you want to come," she said. "There are 3 buildings on the east side that are pre-Civil War. I don't know if you've seen them up close." He looked at her. She held the coffee out toward him in a neutral, patient way. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. They walked for 2 hours. She knew this neighborhood the way you know a place you grew up inside, not just the streets, but the feeling of them. The way certain corners held a specific quality of cold. She talked while she walked, and he listened. And at some point, he started talking back without noticing the moment it began. She had not expected that. She had invited him because she thought he might be useful company on a work walk, someone who understood buildings and wouldn't ask her to explain what she was doing every time she stopped. She had not expected him to be interesting. She had not expected to want to keep the conversation going past the first block. She photographed constantly, moving around him without apology, stopping mid-sentence to crouch and frame something at street level. She was aware of him stopping when she stopped, patient in a way that didn't feel like waiting. It felt like looking. At one point, she turned the camera toward him without thinking. Old reflex. He went completely still, the way people go still when they feel suddenly seen, and she lowered the camera immediately. "Sorry," she said. "Reflex, I won't." "It's fine," he said. But she had caught it, that fraction of a second before he schooled his expression. Something had moved across his face. She filed it away without knowing why. They ended up at a diner on the corner of Hendricks and 4th. They sat across from each other with coffee and eggs neither of them had planned on ordering, and the conversation opened out from work into other things. "Where did you grow up?" he said. "4 blocks from here," she said. "My mother's apartment is still there." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Yours?" "A long way from here," he said. She looked up. "But you stayed." "I stayed for a reason," he said. "The reason is gone. Now I take projects. It keeps me moving." She held his gaze for a moment, not pressing, not retreating. "That makes sense," she said. He was grateful she didn't ask what the reason was. He was surprised also to find that part of him wanted to tell her anyway. He noted that and left it alone. They walked back to the building as the light went flat. At the front door, she stopped and looked up at the facade. "You're going to save it," she said. "That's the plan." She nodded. Then she went downstairs without another word, which was her way. And he understood by now that it was not coldness. She stood in her apartment for a moment after the door closed. She had not planned on any of that. The eggs, the 2 hours of conversation, the ease of it. She put her camera bag down and noticed, with something like wariness, that she was looking forward to seeing him tomorrow. He stood upstairs at the work table for a while before he remembered what he had been intending to do. That second week of November, the cold made a decision for both of them. Neither of them knew it yet. He heard her the first night the temperature dropped below freezing. Not distress, just presence. The particular sound of someone up later than they should be, moving around in the small hours with the quiet care of someone who knows there are sleeping people nearby. He was awake himself, which was not unusual. He lay there and listened, and then it stopped. And he told himself she'd sorted whatever it was. The second night he heard it again. A third night the same. On the 4th morning he found her in the corridor, coming back from the mailboxes with her coat on inside the building, which told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. "Your heat?" he said. She met his eyes with the expression of someone who has already decided a thing is fine and does not intend to be talked out of that position. "It's been a little inconsistent." "Inconsistent," he said. "The radiator in the main room goes out some nights. It comes back by morning. I have adequate blankets." He studied her. The skin around her eyes was slightly tight. She had been cold enough to lose sleep. "I can look at it," he said. "You're a carpenter?" "I grew up in an old house. I know how steam radiators work." A pause. She shifted the envelopes in her hand. "I don't want to interrupt your schedule." "You're not interrupting anything," he said. "I want to look at it." She let him. He had the radiator fixed in 20 minutes. He showed her what to do if it happened again, standing beside her, talking through it without condescension. She was close enough that he could smell the faint scent of the cardamom tea she had made while he worked. Her apartment was small and completely inhabited. Photographs everywhere. not hung for decoration, but pinned and clipped and stacked and leaning, an ongoing conversation she was having with herself about what she was looking at. He didn't look too long. It felt like reading someone's diary. "Better?" she said, when the radiator clicked and the warmth began to move through the pipes again. "Should hold," he said. She nodded, her hands wrapped around her own tea. "Thank you," she said. Then, more quietly, "I don't usually accept help." She heard herself say it and wasn't sure why she had. It wasn't a warning. It was more like handing him something true before she could think better of it. The way you show someone a room in your house you don't normally show people. He looked at her. She wasn't being defensive about it. It was a fact she was offering him. The way you give someone a key to a complicated lock so they understand before they try it. "I know," he said. She looked up from her tea. Something crossed her face, a flicker of something between surprise and warmth. Gone quickly. He picked up his tools and went upstairs. That night he lay awake looking at the ceiling and thought about the expression on her face when he said those two words. He hadn't planned to say them. They had been simply true. The radiator held for 9 more days. Then, on a night in late November, when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours, and something in the old boiler finally surrendered completely, it failed. The whole building below the 4th floor lost heat at once. He was awake when it happened. He heard the building go quiet in the way old buildings go quiet when something central has stopped working, a particular kind of silence, like a held breath. He lay there and waited, and then, just before midnight, he heard the faint knock at his door. She stood in the corridor in a heavy wool sweater and thick socks, her coat folded over her arm, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at him with a complete absence of her usual careful composure, not distressed, just honest. "The whole building," she said. "I know. Come in." She hesitated in the doorway for 1 second, a single breath of deliberation. Then she crossed the threshold. That night, something passed between them that had no name and did not need one. She would spend the next morning pretending it hadn't. She sat on his couch under the blanket he gave her and drank tea, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with cold radiators. He said Sarah's name without planning to. It came out naturally, in the middle of something else, and the name sat in the air between them, and he waited for the usual tightening that came when he said it out loud, but it was softer than usual, different in the quality of the room. Nora did not fill the silence with anything. She didn't rush to express sympathy or move the conversation forward. She simply let the name be there, which was rarer than he could have explained. "How long?" she said after a moment, quietly, not intrusively. 4 years in March." She nodded once, receiving it. They sat in the quiet for a while after that, the building around them cold and still, the small electric heater keeping the main room warm. The city outside was muffled by the late hour, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. At some point, the conversation slowed of its own accord, and she fell asleep on the couch, with her tea half finished and her head tipped back against the cushion. He sat in the armchair for a few minutes watching her breathe, and then he put a second blanket over her, turned off the overhead light, and went to bed. She woke at 5 in the morning in a room she didn't recognize. For one disoriented second, she lay still, heart beating faster than it should have. And then it came back. The cold building, his door, the couch. She sat up slowly. The apartment was warm and the city outside was still dark, and there was a second blanket over her that had not been there when she fell asleep. She sat with that for a moment. She had not let anyone take care of her in a long time. Not since she learned that care could be a way of making you owe someone, that warmth could be a form of leverage. She had been so careful about it. And somehow, in the small hours, without her doing anything at all, he had just covered her. She got up quietly and straightened the couch and washed her cup at the kitchen sink and stood there for a moment in the dark apartment. Then she wrote the note. In the morning, he came out to find the couch neatly straightened, her teacup on the drying rack, and a note on the counter in her handwriting. It said, "Thank you. Radiator repairman comes Thursday. Pastries incoming." He stood in the early morning light and read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer under the work table. He didn't examine the impulse. The pastries came Thursday, 2 of them with a coffee, outside his door at 8 in the morning. This time there was a second note tucked under the lid. It said, "Rooftop at 7 tonight if you want to see something." He was up there at 5 minutes to 7. She arrived with her camera and a thermos of coffee, and she showed him where to stand to see the light hit the water tower on the building 3 blocks north. He stood where she pointed, and the light was extraordinary. Gold going to copper, going to a dark amber that made the old wood of the tank seem to glow from within, as if lit from the inside. "I've been trying to get this shot for 2 years," she said. "The angle from down on the street is always wrong. I needed height." "How did you know it would work from here?" "I didn't," she said. "I hoped." She photographed for 40 minutes without stopping, moving around him with her full concentration, sometimes stepping behind him and using his shoulder as a windbreak without asking. He found he didn't mind. He sat on the low wall at the edge of the terrace with his coffee and watched the light change and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was simply comfortable in a place. At some point, she lowered the camera and came to sit beside him. Close, not touching, the cold sharp on both their faces. She looked out at the city for a long time, the water tower dark now, the last of the light gone. "It's different up here," she said. "I come up most nights," he said, "when I can't sleep." She looked at him sideways. "Does that happen often?" "Often enough." She nodded and didn't push. They sat there until the cold became serious, and then they went inside and she thanked him at the stairwell and went downstairs. He stood on the terrace for another few minutes after she left. The feeling in his chest was something he hadn't identified in a long time. Not grief, not loneliness, something quieter than either. Something that asked a question he was not ready to answer yet. 3 days later, the building had a visitor. Caleb noticed something wrong before he understood what it was. He only saw a man in an expensive coat standing at the building's front entrance when he came back from the hardware store, looking up at the facade with a particular kind of ownership in his posture. The kind of ownership that has nothing to do with the building you are standing in front of. The man turned when Caleb reached the door. He was about Nora's age, dressed well, with an easy smile that arrived before anything else. "I'm looking for Nora Wells," he said. "She lives here. I just want to make sure she's okay. We lost touch." Caleb looked at him steadily. The smile was real enough. The rest of it was not. "Building directories on the wall inside," he said, and opened the door and went upstairs. He didn't know why it stayed with him through the afternoon, only that the man's tone had something in it that landed wrong, a claim being staked without words, and the feeling that followed him up the stairs was something old and instinctive that he had learned to trust. He found out 2 days later. He ran into Nora at the mailboxes, and she was quieter than usual. Something pulled inward, the careful brightness she sometimes wore instead of expression absent entirely. "Are you all right?" he said. She met his eyes. Her hands were still on the envelopes in a way that was not quite still. "An ex showed up," she said. "Nothing I can't handle." "What kind of ex?" he said. She held his gaze. Her jaw was tight and her voice was level, and those two things together told him more than anything she said. "The kind you handle by not engaging," she said. He let it be, because she asked him to by the way she said it. But something in him went very still in the way it went still when he was facing a problem that needed to be thought through carefully before he picked up a tool. That evening, she knocked on his door. She had her camera with her, and a brightness in her expression that he recognized now as a particular kind of armor she wore when something had unsettled her, and she was not prepared to let it show. "Rooftop?" she said. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. They were up there for 3 hours. At some point, the conversation found its way to harder ground. She looked out at the city, and her hands were wrapped around the thermos, and her voice was careful and even. "I thought I was good at reading people," she said. "I was with him for 2 years. I told myself the parts that didn't feel right were things I needed to adjust to, things that would settle." He said nothing. He listened. "I was wrong about that," she said. "I was wrong about what I was adjusting to." A pause. "When I finally left, I made a promise to myself that I would not let anyone close enough to have that kind of access to me again. And since then," he said. She almost smiled. "It has been a remarkably successful policy." He looked at her. The cold was sharp, and her breath came in small clouds, and she sat with her knees slightly drawn up, a contained posture, a body that had learned to take up less space than it needed. "Until recently," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. The look was long and careful, and completely honest. Until recently, she said quietly. He held her gaze and did not look away. Something between them shifted, in the way things shift when two people acknowledge at the same moment that they are standing somewhere new. The city turned below them, and the cold pressed in, and it was one of those silences that does not need to be filled because it is already full. They went inside at midnight, and at the bottom of the stairs, where their paths divided, she stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." "Thank you for telling me," he said. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she went downstairs. He stood in the stairwell for a long moment. His chest was full of something he hadn't felt in 4 years, something that scared him in a way that did not feel at all like grief. The week that followed, they moved closer without appearing to move at all. It was the best week of December. It was also the week he stopped pretending he was leaving. They didn't name it. That was part of what made it work. The absence of label, the freedom of two people who had decided to move toward each other without requiring the movement to be anything specific yet. She brought coffee on Tuesday and stayed for an hour, and the conversation went somewhere easy and alive, the kind that ends and leaves both people slightly surprised by how long it lasted. Neither of them mentioned it. Wednesday, he came down to her apartment in the evening, ostensibly to check that the radiator was holding. It was. She made dinner anyway, something simple with good olive oil and garlic, and they ate by the lamp with the city quiet outside her below-ground windows. She told him about the project she was working on, a long-form series documenting a neighborhood under rezoning, a record made with full knowledge that most of what she was photographing would be gone in 5 years. "Isn't that painful?" he said. "Knowing it won't last." "Isn't restoration painful?" she said. "Knowing the thing you restore will eventually decay again." He considered that. "No," he said. "You do it because it deserves to be cared for now. That's enough." She looked at him across the table. Her expression was open in a way he had come to notice, the way a room looks when the windows are clean and the light comes through differently. He felt it then without any ambiguity. The pull toward her. Not just warmth, not just the pleasure of good conversation, but a specific and undeniable desire to be closer to her than the table allowed. His hands rested flat on the surface in front of him, and he was very aware of the distance between her fingers and his. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, and something in her face tightened for a fraction of a second before she put it face down without answering. "Darren," she said. Not a question, just information offered clearly because she trusted him with it. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Has he come back to the building?" he said. "Once. I didn't answer the door." She picked up her fork again. "He'll get bored eventually. It's what happens when he realizes he has no leverage." "And if he doesn't get bored," she met his eyes. "Then I handle it? The way I always have." He heard the boundary in it. He respected it. He did not say what he was actually thinking, which was that he wanted very much to be the thing standing between her and whatever Darren intended. He kept that to himself and went back to his dinner, but his jaw stayed tight for the rest of the evening. He walked back upstairs and stood in the dark without turning on the light. He stood there for a long time. He had not wanted to protect someone like that, specifically and precisely and completely like that since Sarah. The force of it surprised him. 4 years had made him believe he had closed off that particular room. Now it was standing wide open, and he was just going to have to live with that. On Friday, he knocked on her door with no reason other than the truth of wanting to see her. She opened it, and he said, "There's a good moon tonight." She was quiet for a second. Then she looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but was the warmest thing her face did. "Give me a minute," she said, and got her coat. They were on the rooftop for 2 hours. The moon was full and low and silver, and she stood at the wall with her camera and then slowly let it come down. She turned to him, and there was something different in her face, less defended than he had ever seen it. Some gate that had been standing open for a moment finally acknowledged as open. He was close enough that when he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, it was not a decision. It was simply the next thing. His fingers just grazed her cheekbone. She went very still. The cold was sharp, and the city shone below them, and her face was inches from his, and her eyes were doing something complicated and honest. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I know. I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't apologize," she said. Just give me time. All the time you need, he said. She held his gaze in the moonlight. I'm not sure which frightens me more, she said, that it won't be real, or that it will. He understood that completely. The way people understand things that have lived in their own chest in a different shape. He didn't say so, but something in his expression must have shown it, because she gave him a small smile that went straight through him, unguarded and almost surprised at itself. They stood at the wall for another hour, not quite touching, and the city held them in its cold and luminous silence. December deepened, and so did the thing neither of them had named. He needed to be elsewhere in his head, because Nora was everywhere now. Not intrusively, she still moved carefully and gave him space, but the quality of the building had changed around him. He heard her in the mornings. He noticed when her light was on late. He brought extra coffee when he walked to the corner and left the second cup outside her door. And she did the same, and neither of them said a word about the pattern they had built between them. It simply existed, like the mailbox ritual, like the rooftop on clear nights. Darren had been quiet for 10 days. Caleb had noticed. He had also noticed the way Nora's shoulders had come down slightly in recent days, the way the careful brightness she sometimes wore had softened into something more natural. On a Tuesday evening, she appeared at the top of the stairs. I'm cooking, she said. I made too much? He looked up. An hour, he said. She looked at him for a moment, something soft moving through her expression. An hour, she said, and went back downstairs. He finished what he was doing properly, which was the only way he could do anything, then cleaned up and stood for a moment in the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror, 43 years old, the gray at his temples that had come in fast after Sarah died, the lines at the corners of his eyes from years of looking closely at things. He stood there for a moment and then went downstairs. She had made pasta, and the apartment was warm and smelled like garlic, and they ate by the lamp with her photographs on the walls around them, and the city quiet outside her below-ground windows. They ate and talked, and the conversation moved through many rooms. At one point, she looked at her glass and said, "Time is the only thing I know how to photograph. Everything else is just practice." He looked at her, her face in the lamplight, the particular quality of her attention when she was thinking about something that mattered to her. She looked up and found him looking. After dinner, they washed the dishes together at her small sink, side by side, their arms occasionally close. When she handed him a wine glass to dry, their fingers met and neither of them moved away immediately. He felt her go still. Her eyes came up to his. The kitchen was very quiet. The city outside was muffled and far away. He turned toward her slowly, giving her every possible moment to decide, to step back or step forward or hold still. She looked at him with eyes that were doing several things at once, fear and warmth, and that honesty she had, that was becoming the thing about her he most counted on. He touched her face with one hand. She closed her eyes for a moment and he felt her exhale. Then she kissed him. It was brief, a soft, warm pressure, tentative and completely decided at once. She pulled back and looked at him, and her face was entirely open, every wall down, more undefended than he had ever seen it, and it was the most frightened he had ever seen her look. "Okay," she said softly, as if answering something only she could hear. He rested his forehead against hers. Her hands had found the front of his sweater. He could feel them trembling slightly. "Okay," he said. They stood there in her kitchen in the warm light for a long moment, not moving further, not rushing, just being there together, in the weight and warmth of the first thing that had been allowed to be real. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and the moment broke naturally, and she laughed a small, shaky laugh and stepped back. He looked at the phone, and it was work, something about permits, and he put it away. "I should let you sleep," he said. She walked him to the door. At the threshold, she looked up at him with the new openness in her face. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." That was. She paused, chose it honestly. It was good. "Yes," he said. It was. He went upstairs. He sat at the work table and did not work. He sat with his hands flat on the wood and felt the warmth in his chest and did not fight it. And it was the first time since Sarah that something had felt like beginning. 4 days after the kiss, she told him she was fine. He had already decided not to believe her. She had been out with the camera before dawn, walking Hendricks Row in the early cold because the overnight ice was doing something extraordinary to the stone surfaces. She had the photograph she'd been waiting 3 winters for. She also had the beginning of a chill that had started in her spine before she reached the building, and that she was, as she always was with such things, actively ignoring. He noticed at the mailboxes. Her color was wrong, a bright flush on her cheekbones that had nothing to do with the cold outside. She was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body is doing something their mind hasn't fully agreed to acknowledge. "You're sick," he said. She met his eyes with her usual composure. "I'm fine." Nora. Something in his voice, some particular quality of it, made her look at him differently. The composure held for a moment, and then she looked away. Maybe a small chill. He brought her soup from the place on 4th Street and knocked on her door an hour later. She opened it looking worse than she had at the mailboxes, the flush on her face dark and hot, her eyes too bright, her hair loose and slightly damp. She was still in her work clothes. She hadn't quite managed to lie down. "Come and sit," he said. "I told you I know what you told me," he said. He kept his voice gentle. "Come and sit." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and went to the couch. He heated the soup in her kitchen and carried it to her and put it in her hands. She ate slowly, only managing about half before setting the bowl down. He took it back to the kitchen and washed it, and came back to find her lying down on the couch with her eyes closed, not asleep but very close. He put the extra blanket over her and turned the lamp low and sat in the chair in the corner while she drifted. By 10 o'clock, her temperature was clearly higher. He could hear it in her breathing. "You should sleep in my bed," he said. "Better mattress, and the heat upstairs is more consistent." She opened her eyes and looked at him from the couch. "I'm all right here." "The bed is better," he said. "I'll take the chair." "You're going to sit in a chair all night." "I'll sleep in the chair," he said. "I've slept in worse." A pause. She studied him in the low light with eyes that were tired and a little soft at the edges. "You'll actually sleep?" "I'll actually sleep," he said. The truth was that he would not. He knew that before he said it. But she needed the bed and the warmth, and so he said it. He helped her upstairs, one hand at her back on the stairwell. He was aware of how light she felt against his palm, the particular hollowness that fever brings. He got her settled in the bed with 2 blankets and a glass of water on the night table and the aspirin she needed. She looked at him for a moment with fever-soft eyes, undefended, and then she closed them. She was asleep before he had turned the lamp to its lowest setting. He sat in the armchair by the window and watched her breathe. The city outside was quiet. A few cars, a distant siren that faded. The lamp threw a low, warm circle across the floor and across her face, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and watched her the way you watch something you are afraid of losing. He told himself it was practical. She was sick, and someone should be awake in case she needed something, but the truth of it was simpler and ran deeper than any practical argument. 4 years had taught him a specific self-sufficiency, the ability to be in a room without needing anyone else in it. He had built that ability carefully, one project at a time, one quiet evening at a time. He had been wrong to think it was permanent. He looked at her face, finally quiet against his pillow, and the door he had kept locked for 4 years was standing wide open in his chest, and on the other side of it was not grief. It was the particular fear of wanting something again. The particular vulnerability of a person who has learned that wanting can mean losing, and who is choosing to want anyway. He sat with that. He did not fight it or diminish it. He sat in the armchair while the city went slowly toward dawn, and he watched her breathe, and every time she shifted, he went still, and the feeling in his chest did not get smaller. She woke once in the night briefly and found him in the chair. She looked at him for a moment in the low light. "You stayed," she said, her voice rough with sleep and fever. "Go back to sleep," he said quietly. She held his eyes for a second longer. Then she turned her face back into the pillow and went under again. He sat there until morning came in gray and cold through the high windows, and the feeling in his chest was the largest thing in the room. She was almost ready. She would spend the rest of that week not knowing how close she had come. She was better by the 3rd day. By the 4th, she was herself again, or nearly, still slightly quieter than usual, still moving with a care that suggested her energy was something she was managing. She thanked him in the spare, honest way she thanked him for everything. "You didn't sleep," she said, the morning she came back downstairs. He was working on the third floor and looked up. I slept. She looked at him. Caleb. I slept enough, he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching him. Something moved through her expression that she didn't put words to, something warm and slightly undone. Then she went back downstairs. The kiss had not been discussed, not in the way it needed to be. They moved around it the way you move around something warm in a cold room, aware of it always, not yet standing directly in front of it. He was patient. He had learned from Sarah that the things worth waiting for were worth waiting for properly. Darren came back on a Thursday morning. Caleb did not know about the first part. He did not know that Darren had found Nora alone in the building's entryway when she was coming in from her walk. He did not know that the conversation had been low and precise and controlled, that Darren had his phone out and showed her photographs and messages, private things from years ago, presented out of sequence and without context in a way that was entirely familiar to anyone who had ever lived inside that particular kind of cruelty. The technique was not new. It had a name. She had lived inside it for 2 years, and she knew its architecture from the inside. He had told her clearly and quietly that if she did not put distance between herself and the man upstairs, he would find a way to make those materials public. It did not matter that they were nothing. What mattered was that he had them, and that she knew he was capable of using them because she had watched him do it before. Nora had said nothing. She had held herself completely still and let him finish, and then she had walked past him to the stairwell door. Caleb was working on the second floor when he heard voices in the lobby below. He came to the landing and saw Darren standing there, easy and conversational, asking about the restoration work, looking up at the ceiling with apparent interest. The performance of a man making ordinary small talk while calculating exactly what impression he is making. Caleb answered briefly and went back upstairs. That evening, Nora's light stayed off. He sent a text asking if she needed anything, and the reply came back quickly, the way someone sends a message they have pre-composed. Just tired tonight. He believed it because he had no reason not to. The next morning, she was gone. Not gone the way people leave for work. Her mailbox was full. Her apartment had the silence of a space that has been vacated rather than merely unoccupied. He knocked twice and waited, and the building said what buildings say when their people are not in them. He stood in the corridor for a long time. Then he went upstairs and sat at the work table and put his hands flat on the wood and stayed there. He did not understand what had happened. He knew only that something had, and that the cold feeling in his chest was familiar, and that he was not willing to accept it as final without knowing why. That evening, he set the table. He had been planning this for 4 days. The good olive oil, the wine he had selected on Tuesday, candles, 2 of them, set in the center of the table, not elaborate, just careful. And the thing he had been carrying in his chest for weeks now, the thing that had cost him 4 years to arrive at, the thing he had finally this week found the simple words for. He was going to tell her he was ready. That was all it would have taken. Those 3 words. He sat at the table, and the candles burned, and the dinner went cold, and the city outside went dark, and she did not come. He sat there for a long time. The candles burned most of the way down. Then he blew them out, and the room was dark, and the cold was just a cold, and he sat with it. 5 days of silence. He used them well. He had not been idle in them. He had asked careful questions of the neighbor on the first floor who had seen Nora leave that morning, and he had pieced together what he could. She had packed a bag. She had left before the building properly woke up. She had mentioned, once in passing months ago, a friend who lived on the other side of the city, a name she had used with the particular shorthand of someone she trusted. He had sat with what he knew and been honest about it. She had left after seeing Darren talking to him in the lobby. She had not heard the conversation. She had seen only the image of the 2 of them standing there, and whatever Darren had said to her in the entryway beforehand had been precisely calibrated to ensure that that image carried the worst possible meaning. He understood now. He understood the whole shape of it. He went to the hotel. It took 1 call to the concierge. Darren was in a junior suite on the 6th floor, the kind of hotel that catered to people who needed to be comfortable in a city where they were only passing through. Caleb waited in the lobby. When Darren came through, he looked at Caleb with the particular expression of someone who has been expecting this and has prepared for it. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not move toward him. He simply stood in the lobby in his work clothes, with his rough hands and his considerable stillness, and he said very quietly that whatever Darren had shown Nora, whatever he had said to her, whatever hold he believed he had over her was finished now. That if he came to the building again, or contacted her in any form, or attempted to use any material he claimed to have against her, Caleb would ensure that every person in Nora's life understood exactly what kind of man was making those claims and why. He said this not as a threat, but as a statement of what was going to happen. Darren looked at him. The easy manner recalibrated itself very slightly. Then he said nothing and walked toward the elevator. Caleb went back to the building. He stood in the street and looked up at the facade he had been working on for 2 months. Evidence of work done carefully for its own sake, because things worth preserving deserved to be preserved. He went upstairs and worked. He worked through the weekend. He did not send messages. He did not go looking. He gave her the time she needed to come back on her own terms, because that was the only thing worth giving her. On the 7th day, he heard the door below. Her footsteps in the stairwell, slow and stopping once at the second-floor landing, a pause that lasted long enough for him to understand what it cost her, and then continuing up. The knock at his door. He opened it. She stood in the corridor with her bag still on her shoulder, her face a map of the week she had had. Exhausted and ashamed, and wanting to explain and not knowing how to start, all of it visible at once because she was not defending herself anymore. "I saw him talking to you," she said, "and I ran." "I know," he said. "I thought he had already told you. The things he had, I thought you already knew and that you were going to." Her breath caught. "Come inside," he said. She came in and sat on the couch. He sat in the chair across from her, close enough that she didn't have to project. "Tell me what he said to you," he said. She told him. All of it. The entryway, the phone, the photographs, the calibrated threat of a man who knew exactly which fear to aim at. He listened without moving. When she finished, the room was quiet. "He has nothing," Caleb said. "Whatever he showed you was built to frighten you. That's all it was." "You didn't see what?" "It doesn't matter what it was," he said. "I know you." He held her gaze. "Whatever he had, it was not what he told you it was. Because that is how he works, and I know that now, because you told me." Her eyes went bright. She looked down at her hands. Her chin trembled slightly. "I ran," she said. "You made me dinner, and you had candles, and I ran." He was quiet for a moment. "You protected yourself," he said. "That is what you know how to do, and it has kept you safe. I don't hold it against you." "I hold it against myself," she said. "Don't," he said. "You're here now." She looked up, and the tears she had been holding back came then, not dramatically, but quietly, the way things release when they are no longer being held. He stood and crossed to the couch, and she turned into him, pressing her face against his shoulder, her hands gripping the front of his sweater. He held her, his hand on the back of her head, not speaking, just present, just here. Her breathing slowed and steadied, and the city outside was quiet and the room was warm, and he held her until the shaking stopped. On the 7th day, her footsteps came up the stairs and stopped once at the second floor. She was deciding. He was already at the door. When she lifted her head, she looked at him with clear eyes and a face that was completely her own. No armor, nothing managed or performed. She had been crying for a few minutes, and she was done now, and she looked at him without apology for any of it. "I sat in my friend's apartment for 5 days," she said, "and I kept coming back to the look on your face. On the rooftop, in my kitchen. All the times you looked at me in a way I told myself I was imagining." "You were not imagining it," he said. "I know that now." She held his gaze. "I kept trying to build a case for why I should stay away. And every case I built fell apart because the reason you make me afraid is not the reason Darren made me afraid. It's the opposite reason." He waited. "He made me afraid of what he would take," she said. "You make me afraid of what I might actually want, what I might need." She looked at her hands for a moment. "Needing something from someone is the most frightening thing I know how to do." The words settled between them in the quiet room. "I was going to say something to you at that dinner," he said. "I had been trying to find the right words for a long time, but I don't think there are right words. So I'll use the true ones." He met her eyes. "I'm ready. I have been somewhere between the past and the future for 4 years, taking projects, staying in motion, not quite here, not quite present, And then I came to this building, and somewhere without quite deciding to, I became here. Present. In the actual present. A pause. That is because of you. I don't want to be anywhere else. She was very still. Her throat moved. Her chin held steady. Her eyes were clear and full and completely honest. I don't know how to do this without being afraid, she said quietly. Neither do I, he said. But I think being afraid and doing it anyway is the only way it works. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he could see her arrive somewhere. Okay, she said. The same word. The one she used when she had made a decision and meant it completely. He kissed her, fully, with both hands framing her face, and she kissed him back with nothing held in reserve. And it was nothing like the first brief kiss in her kitchen, which had been tentative and full of question. This was an answer. This was two people who had arrived somewhere together and were choosing it. They pulled back, and she pressed her forehead to his, and he felt her exhale, long and slow, and the tension went out of her shoulders under his hands. He held her there for a moment in the quiet of the room. 3 days later, he made the dinner again. The table, the candles, the good olive oil, the wine he had put aside. She came upstairs with her own bottle and a look on her face that was the best thing he had seen in a very long time. Something open and deliberate and not afraid of being seen. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table. You kept the candles, she said. They were always part of the plan, he said. She came inside and set her bottle on the table and looked at him. Tell me something, she said. The night I was sick, you really sat in that chair all night. I really sat in that chair all night, he said. She looked at him for a moment. That's what I thought, she said quietly. They ate and talked for 2 hours, and she told him she had spoken with a lawyer about Darren's conduct and that Darren had left the city within days. She said it as a fact, something resolved, the way you set down a tool when the work is done. After dinner, she helped him clear the table. When she turned from the counter and saw the candles still burning, she stopped. You set the table with candles, she said. I always planned to. Even the first time. Even the first time, he said. She looked at him with that expression she had, the one that went all the way to her eyes, warm and fully present and not afraid. She crossed the room and kissed him, one hand on his jaw. He held her close. The candles burned down to their last inch. The city moved outside, and neither of them moved to say goodnight. At some point, she looked up at him. I don't have to go downstairs tonight, she said, not a question. Calm and deliberate, the way she made every decision she actually meant. He looked at her. She was awake and clear-eyed in choosing this, which was completely different from the last time she had been in his apartment in the small hours, fever-flushed and beyond defending herself. This was not a practical solution. This was not a neighbor doing what neighbors do. No, he said. You don't. She stayed. She lay in his bed in the dark and listened to the city and felt with a steadiness that surprised her that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. No dread, no waiting for the other shoe. Just the warm room and the sound of him settling in the chair. And then, when she said his name once, quietly, him coming to lie beside her on top of the blanket, close but not crowding her, and both of them lying there in the dark, like two people who have been moving toward each other for a long time and have finally arrived. She did not fall asleep for a while. She lay there and looked at the ceiling and thought about the fact that 3 months ago she had not known his name, and now she was here, and it did not feel like a mistake. It felt like the thing she had been protecting herself from was not this. It had never been this. And the building held them both the way old buildings hold everything, with patience and with all the time they need. March came in cold and then softened. By then, he had already made his decision. Only the facade remained. He stood on the scaffold in the pale morning light, working at the stone with his chisel. Below him, the street was waking up. A bus, a man with a dog. The bakery on Reed Street turning on its lights. He had not left. He had understood in January gradually and then completely that he was not going to. Not when the project ended. Not when the formal reason to be here was finished. He was staying, and the reason was 3 floors below him in an apartment full of photographs, probably already out with her camera in the early cold. He had told her this on a Sunday in February, at her kitchen table with coffee and the morning coming in through her below-ground windows. She had looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. You know, I have been watching you decide for 2 weeks, she said. You do this thing with your hands when you're working something through. You press them flat against whatever surface is near. He looked down at his hands on the table. I have been watching your hands, she said, without any self-consciousness at all, the way she would describe how she watched a building. He looked up at her. She was watching him with the full force of her attention, the way she photographed the things she wanted to understand and preserve. Are you glad? He said. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Are you? Yes, he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held it. They sat in the morning light, and the coffee went slowly cold, and neither of them moved, and outside the city did its patient and indifferent turning. That spring, Nora had a new exhibition. She called it What Holds. 32 photographs of the neighborhood where she had grown up, taken over the past 4 months. Buildings in winter light, buildings at dawn, stone surfaces in ice, the water tower at golden hour. At the center of the exhibition were 2 photographs. One was a close-up of a pair of hands, rough and careful, working at old wood. The other was the view from the penthouse terrace at night, the city spread below, taken from the vantage point of the low wall she had first seen from, while he sat beside her with his coffee. He stood in front of those 2 photographs for a long time. He stood there until the room around him had emptied a little, and the conversations had moved, and the evening was quieter. She came to stand beside him. He felt her before he heard her, the particular warmth of her presence at his shoulder. You should have asked me, he said. You would have said yes, she said. He looked at her. She was right, and she knew it, and she was not apologizing for it. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they looked at the photographs together, at the hands, at the city at night, at the record she had made of what had been seen and attended to and found worth preserving. Outside, the spring evening was coming on over the rooftops of the city. The building on Elliott Street stood whole and clean, its facade restored, its windows returned to their original proportions. Somewhere inside it, on a terrace at the top, 2 coffee cups had been left out against the cold rail of a low wall, next to each other, as they had been left most evenings now since December. And the 2 of them stood together in the good warm light of what they had built, slowly and without plan and with their eyes open. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of thing that holds. If you made it all the way to the end, please subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. I'd love to hear from you. On a scale of 0 to 10, how did this story make you feel? Drop your rating in the comments. I'll read every single one. I'm truly grateful you're here. See you in the next story.